In the Edexcel exam, you do have to show some awareness of a poem's context, which is why I always begin my videos with some wider discussion about the poet and how this particular work fits into that poet's worldview, if you like. Some poems, for example, Belfast Confetti, refer to historical events that you really need to know about if you're going to fully understand the poem. Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, Owen's Exposure. These are other examples where clearly you need a context in order to fully understand the poem's message. So I would encourage you not to whiz forward past these introductory remarks. Regarding the context for this poem, you need to know something about Romanticism, or the Romantic movement in poetry, which Wordsworth, with his very close friend Coleridge, founded, really. The other two Romantic poets in the Edexcel conflict anthology are William Blake, with his Poison Tree, and the Lord Byron poem. So this context can also be applied to those two. Christina Rossetti, Thomas Hardy and Alfred Tennyson, incidentally, they're Victorian poets. All the other poets in the anthology are of course contemporary, most of them still writing today. Don't be put off by the overlap between the dates here, by the way. That's what poetic movements are like. It's not one day the Romantic period finishes and the next day the Victorians start. There's obviously a period of overlap, and Victorian writers are concerned with many of the same things actually as the Romantics were. Now, focusing on Romanticism, some of you might be disappointed to hear that it wasn't about love and romance at all, really. The defining feature of Romanticism is an interest in nature. More than that, a glorification of nature. Romantics, and Wordsworth in particular, frequently expressed pantheist views. That is, a belief that nature is God, God is nature. He's not a separate identity. So God is a presence dwelling everywhere, in mountains, in sky, in trees, and in people. So this is quite a revolutionary view, really, and the French Revolution was going on during the Romantic period, that there are no hierarchies. Everything is divine because God is in everything. Presence can be felt everywhere. So you could describe Wordsworth as quite literally a nature worshipper. And here he is, painted in a natural setting. He grew up in the Lake District, which is probably where he's pictured here, an area of the world he absolutely loved, and he would go for long, long walks with his close friend Coleridge and think about poetry on these walks, inspired by the countryside that he walked through. The Prelude is a really long poem, an epic poem, written in 14 books. So what we're looking at in the anthology is just a very short extract from that. It's from book 1, actually. And Wordsworth spent most of his life working on the Prelude. It wasn't published until after he died. It is an autobiographical poem. It's about the growth of a boy into a poet, really. And he describes spots in time within the Prelude, experiences that shaped him as a man and as a poet, which developed his philosophy. In the extract we're going to hear now, he explores one of these points in time, these spots in time, and you can see how the landscape does develop its own life force within the poem. And you can see too the emergence of a pantheist outlook. We'll listen to a reading of the poem now and then explore that idea in a bit more detail in relation to its structure, the point of view, Wordsworth's use of imagery, and of course the main themes in the work.
Extract from the Prelude by William Wordsworth. One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth, untroubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still, on either side, small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rose, proud of his skill, to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily, I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and, as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When, from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head, I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. O'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, move slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams.
I've already referred to the Prelude as an epic poem, so just to explain that term, an epic poem is one which focuses on the story of a hero and that hero's heroic deeds, so it's a lengthy narrative poem. Wordsworth's Prelude, of course, tells the story of a boy and his growth into a man. It traces his spiritual development. So, as we would expect with somebody at the forefront of a movement, a new way of writing poetry, it's a different take on the epic. It's not about heroism, it's about personal experience and ordinary people. So the extract in the anthology is from book 1, which is called Childhood and Schooltime. Not your typical epic content. The sequence of ideas in this extract is very straightforward. Wordsworth recalls how he stole a boat and went for a row on a lake in it. A mountain peak loomed over him and absolutely terrified him, and then the memory of that mountain haunted him for days afterwards. He was really troubled by the experience. Like 3/4 of English poetry, according to one critic, the Prelude is written in blank verse, meaning it is written in unrhyming lines of iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter will of course be very familiar to you through your study of Shakespeare. The rhythm through the poem is quite slow and sedate, a storytelling pace really established by Wordsworth, and that iambic rhythm and the longish lines allows that. You'll have gathered already then that this is an epic poem written in the past tense and the first person because it's autobiographical. In this extract, Wordsworth's talking about an experience that he had as a boy. The language is quite conversational. It certainly would have seemed it then, maybe less so now when we're used to informality in poetry. But both Coleridge and Wordsworth wanted to develop a new voice, one that used the language of regular people, not the stuffy poet speak of classical writers that went before them. It's an emotional voice as well, and the Romantics didn't shy away from the emotions. In fact, Wordsworth's definition of poetry, a very famous definition, is that it is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So certainly powerful feelings in this extract. We'll look now at its imagery in some detail, and you'll see the way the imagery darkens as the experience of the child becomes more and more terrifying. There are no stanzas in the Prelude, but I've broken it up for the purposes of this analysis, so here are the first few lines of our extract. One summer morning, led by her, I found a little boat. Led by her is a reference to nature, which is personified here, so already you see the development of this pantheist way of thinking. Nature is speaking to the boy, leading him, led by her. Notice that nature is described in a very comforting way, and its beauty is also emphasised in these opening lines. So, for example, the boat has a home. The rocky cove is its usual home. It's a summer evening, which is pleasant. The scene is moonlit, and adjectives like glittering and sparkling create a sense of nature's incredible beauty. You can picture that line of glittering light behind the boat, which, again, like nature, is personified, perhaps making her sound like the boy's friend. He's certainly on his own in the middle of this lake, but at this point in the narrative, he doesn't feel isolated. On a close reading, though, you can pick up a sense of foreboding. Perhaps the boy has a troubled conscience, and this is what creates the foreboding, because he did, after all, steal the boat. He says it was an act of stealth, so he took it without anybody looking. It wasn't his boat. And he describes the experience on the lake as a troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes. Personification again, the mountains have a voice, they're echoing, and putting those echoes next to this idea of a troubled pleasure, perhaps these are rumblings from the mountains of disapproval. Now, to row a boat in a straight line, you have to fix your eye on a point in the distance, and that's what the poet describes doing in this section of the narrative. I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge. So he looks at the top of a mountain, the top of a ridge, in order to take his line from that. He says he's proud of his skill and he wants to cut an unswerving line through the water. Lustily means with vigour, so again a strong sense of him enjoying this really physical, intense experience. The boat is compared with a swan. It moves through the water like a swan, so it's a beautiful thing. The boat's also described metaphorically as an elfin pinnace. Now, a pinnace is a small boat, but elfin's an interesting adjective used to describe it and connotes an otherworldliness. This, along with the voices from the mountains and the moonlight, begins to feel mystical. Then suddenly the boy's perspective, what he's actually seeing, changes. Don't forget he's moving through this water, and a huge peak, black and huge, emerges into view, and it terrifies him. Notice the repetition of the word huge there, and black connotes something menacing. This peak is personified as a terrifying enemy. It upreared its head. In response, with a sense of rising panic, the boy struck and struck again, that repetition emphasising his desperate rowing away. Terrifyingly, the grim shape, the peak, seems to be growing, seems to be getting bigger. It towered up between me and the stars. Even worse, it strode after me. So the peak has now, in the imagination of the boy, literally come alive, and it's pursuing him. So trembling, he returns to the covert of the willow tree, leaves his boat there, described here as a bark, another word for boat, and then returns home through the meadows in grave and serious mood. So this experience, almost a visionary experience, has had a really profound effect on him. And it's an effect that lasts for days. It's not forgotten as soon as he gets back. My brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. That phrase, unknown modes of being, worth trying to remember as a quote. What Wordsworth does throughout the Prelude is tell stories and then tries to draw moral or philosophical conclusions from those stories, from those recollected experiences. And that's what he's doing now in this final phase of the extract. Remember what I said earlier about pantheism. Here perhaps is the emergence of the pantheist vision that God lives in everything. God is nature. God is not a separate being. The God of this experience was a terrifying one, and perhaps that reflects the fact that the boy had a troubled conscience. He was doing something wrong. But clearly for him, that great peak that towered over him, it wasn't just a mountain. It was a presence, a living presence. He concludes at the end of this extract that his dreams were troubled by this, and during his waking hours he wasn't even able to see nature's beauty anymore. He couldn't see pleasant images of trees, sea or sky. The green fields lost their colour. His whole mind then was dominated by this great black peak and the presence that he felt within it. So if nature is God, then God can be terrifying sometimes. Remember how the mighty glittering army in Byron's poem is quickly overwhelmed by nature, shiny armour turning to rust overnight. And this poem too reminds us that humanity doesn't have authority over nature. In fact, if anything, it's the other way around. In the presence of that huge mountain and whatever force it is that moves within it, the boy is nothing. So it's perhaps his insignificance in the scheme of things that haunts his dreams and weighs down his thoughts when he's awake. It's a very oppressive idea for him at this stage in his development. Related to that is the idea of isolation, and that's a theme that's strong right from the opening of the poem. Initially, of course, the boy enjoys his isolation, the solitary experience on the lake, but then that becomes a threatening thing, and by the end of the poem, he feels utterly deserted. On one level, I suppose as well, pantheism isn't a very comforting philosophy, because we can't tell ourselves that there's a God who loves us, who is looking after us, and who will welcome us into heaven at the end of our lives. Pantheism says that God is nature, we're part of nature, and that makes us at once divine, but at the same time not special, no more special than a tree or the ocean. Not such a comforting thought, perhaps.